For thousands of years, the pyramids of Egypt have defied logic, science, and history itself. Today, we will dive into the cracks of the official story, where the questions are bigger than the answers. Get ready, because what you're about to hear could change the way you understand our past forever. The official version. Happy workers? The story we have heard time and again, repeated almost like a mantra in documentaries, textbooks, and museums, presents a curiously kind image of the construction of the pyramids. Thousands of well-fed workers, organized in shifts, with housing, medical care, and even some social recognition. Men proud of their work, leaving behind one of the greatest architectural wonders of humanity. Over the past few decades, this vision has completely replaced the old belief that the pyramids were built by enslaved, oppressed workers. But how did we get to this point? When was it decided that the story of slaves was too uncomfortable and had to be replaced by a more optimistic one? The transformation of the narrative did not happen by chance, nor as a result of a groundbreaking discovery that cleared up all doubts. Until the mid-20th century, the prevailing idea was that the pyramids had been built with a slave labor force. This approach was based on classical texts, such as Herodotus's Chronicles, and on basic logic. To move millions of stone blocks weighing several tons in a relatively short time, an immense workforce was needed, probably forced. Moreover, the historical context of ancient Egypt, a civilization with extreme social hierarchies, seemed to confirm this hypothesis. However, starting in the 1990s, new research began to spread that would give an unexpected twist to the general interpretation. Excavations led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and his team in the area near the Giza Plateau uncovered remains that were interpreted as worker villages. Skeletal remains showed signs of having received medical care, fractured bones that showed signs of healing properly, suggesting these people had been treated after accidents. Animal remains also appeared, indicating a diet with animal proteins, something that was not initially expected in the diet of mere slaves. These findings were enough for numerous headlines to proclaim the new discovery. The pyramids were not built by slaves, but by free workers. The news spread quickly. International media adopted it without much questioning, fascinated by the possibility of rewriting history from a more humane and politically correct perspective. But stopping here would be superficial. The political and social context of Egypt at the time played a much more important role than is usually acknowledged. In the midst of a search for a strong national identity, and with a government trying to reinforce Egyptian pride, promoting an image of patriotic workers, proud to have built the pyramids, it was much more convenient to maintain the narrative of a past of oppression and slavery. Furthermore, Hawass's figure became an emblem of official archaeology. His firm control over excavations and the dissemination of information made him the main spokesperson for this new version. Soon, any theory contradicting this narrative began to be relegated or outright ridiculed. The problem is that the evidence presented, although interesting, is far from conclusive. For example, the human remains found near Giza correspond to only a tiny percentage compared to the number of people who would have been necessary to build the pyramids within the traditionally accepted timeline. The Great Pyramid, in particular, is estimated to have required moving over 2 million blocks, many of which weighed so much they defy any attempt at logistical rationalization without a massive workforce. If the official version were entirely true, we should have found not dozens or hundreds, but thousands and thousands of skeletons. We should have found remains of a massive and permanent infrastructure, makeshift hospitals, communal kitchens, tool storage, rest facilities, but that hasn't happened. Another delicate point is the interpretation of the diet of these supposed workers. The animal remains found include cows, goats, and sheep, but the quantities found are again insufficient when considering a labor force of such magnitude. The argument that they were well fed is supported by extrapolations that, at best, are partial. Furthermore, the fact that skeletons with fractures that healed were found does not necessarily imply kind treatment or dignified working conditions. Even in the most oppressive societies in history, when labor was valuable, it was not uncommon to try to keep it functional, to continue exploiting it. The pressure to create a more acceptable narrative for international public opinion has also been decisive. Tourism is one of Egypt's main sources of income, and it is much more attractive for the modern visitor to imagine heroic workers than masses of exploited slaves. Presenting the pyramids as the result of a collective, voluntary, and almost epic effort fits better with current sensibilities. No one wants to visit a symbol of human suffering, but rather a monument to ingenuity and perseverance. Another aspect that is rarely discussed in depth is the lack of administrative documents supporting this version. In a country where even the most banal aspects of daily life were documented, where there are lists of offerings, inventories of temples, and tax records, it is strange that we do not have a single detailed document describing the organization of such a massive labor project. There are no supply lists for thousands of workers, no payment records, nor personnel censuses. The famous Merer's Diary, which some cite as key evidence, refers only to the transport of limestone from Tura and does not mention any logistical details of the pyramid construction. Neither has it been possible to find any reference in funerary texts or official inscriptions that honors or even mentions this supposed working class. In a culture obsessed with recording every aspect of life and death, the silence about the human effort behind the pyramid is deafening. How can we explain that there are no hymns, songs, or reliefs celebrating such a collective feat? The historical invisibility of these happy workers is, at the very least, suspicious. Finally, the process by which this narrative was imposed also deserves analysis. The combination of partial findings, political interests, control over archaeological information, and the need to fit the new evidence into a more comfortable story has created an accepted truth that, at its core, has as many gaps as the previous hypothesis. The story of the happy workers seems more like a product of the social and political needs of the time than the result of conclusive and irrefutable evidence. The mystery remains, and as we delve into the next points of this journey, the cracks in the official history will continue to widen. Because understanding who really built the pyramids first requires seriously questioning all the versions we've been told, including, of course, this one. Unmanageable blocks. Talking about the pyramids of Egypt inevitably involves talking about stone. A colossal amount of stone, so vast that even today it is difficult to fully comprehend. The Great Pyramid of Giza, also known as the Pyramid of Khufu, is the best example of this disproportionate scale. It is estimated to be made up of more than 2,300,000 stone blocks, each weighing mostly between 2 and 15 tons. But what truly elevates the enigma to another level are the isolated blocks, strategically placed in inner chambers or critical structural areas, which exceed 70 or even 80 tons. We're talking about rocks that, in the 21st century, would require specialized heavy machinery to move them safely. The problem doesn't end with the weight. There's also the distance. Many of the stones used in the construction came from quarries located several kilometers away. The lighter, more abundant limestone mainly came from the Tura quarry, about 15 kilometers southeast. But the granite, found in key areas like the King's Chamber, came from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south. Transporting granite blocks of such size and weight down the Nile, unloading them, and then carrying them uphill to the Giza Plateau is a logistical feat that, even by today's standards, would require meticulous planning, immense resources, and technology that, officially, the Egyptians of the 3rd millennium BC did not possess. When reviewing modern engineering calculations applied to the case of the pyramids, the situation becomes even more baffling. Various studies conducted by structural engineers have attempted to recreate on paper how those blocks would be moved and placed today. Most agree that heavy-duty cranes, special trucks, and highly qualified team coordination would be necessary. Even in that scenario, the process would be slow, costly, and dangerous. But the pyramid builders didn't have steel, combustion engines, or advanced hydraulics. Ancient Egyptian technology, according to the official chronology, was limited to ropes, wood, mud ramps, and a basic understanding of levers. The ramp hypothesis, for example, has long been the most popular explanation for how the blocks were raised. According to this theory, immense ramps made of sand and adobe would have been built to drag the stones up to the desired height. However, when one analyzes the amount of material needed to construct a ramp that could reach the original 146-meter height of the Great Pyramid, the theory begins to fall apart. The most conservative calculations estimate that the ramp would have required more material than the pyramid itself. Moreover, there are no archaeological remains of such a structure, and the logistical implications of building and then dismantling this colossal ramp are, to put it mildly, unrealistic. Some alternative studies have proposed more creative solutions, such as spiral ramps around the pyramid or counterweight systems. But while these ideas are ingenious, they still don't solve the fundamental question. How could blocks weighing tens of tons be moved with the technology available more than 4,500 years ago? To date, no real-scale experiment has successfully replicated the process. Modern attempts, conducted under controlled conditions with contemporary technical resources, have been modest and, in many cases, unsuccessful. Another detail often overlooked is the precision with which these blocks were placed. It's not enough to imagine a team of men dragging a stone up a ramp. One must consider the level of alignment and fitting they achieved. The base of the Great Pyramid has a margin of error of only a few centimeters along its more than 230-meter length on each side. The corners are almost perfectly aligned with the cardinal points, and many of the blocks fit together with a precision that defies modern construction standards. Even today, constructing a building with such a level of accuracy would require laser measurement instruments and specialized topographical equipment. The texture of the surfaces of certain blocks adds another layer of mystery. Some stones have cuts so clean they seem to have been made by diamond saws. Some exhibit curves and interior angles that could hardly have been achieved with copper tools or rudimentary techniques. Even if we assume that time and human ingenuity can achieve wonders, the lack of concrete evidence on how these cuts were made remains a stumbling block for the traditional explanation. We must not lose sight of the fact that this logistical and technical challenge didn't happen just once, but millions of times. Moving a giant block once may be a remarkable feat, but repeating the operation more than 2 million times, maintaining a constant pace, and meeting construction deadlines that some historians place at under 3 decades, seems more like a science fiction exercise than a historical reality. Any modern construction project of such scale, no matter how large the team or resources, would require more time. Those who defend the orthodox explanation often argue that a massive workforce combined with a nearly militarized organization allowed these difficulties to be overcome. But even then, the equation doesn't quite add up. The coordination required to move hundreds of blocks per day, the need for well-maintained roads, the control of weight, the angle of inclination of the ramps, the resistance of the ropes, and friction on the ground present physical and logistical dilemmas that remain without a convincing answer. Moreover, when these challenges are compared to the documented technological capabilities of other civilizations of the time, the gap becomes even more evident. No other known culture of the same period left evidence of undertaking works of such scale and precision. The great Mesopotamian constructions, for example, were massive, but much less demanding in terms of structural engineering. European megaliths, while impressive, are light years away from the complexity of the Great Pyramid. Some independent researchers, frustrated by the lack of clear answers, have begun to propose alternative theories. There is talk of lost technologies, of advanced knowledge of physics that mysteriously disappeared, and even of the intervention of unknown civilizations. These ideas, although systematically rejected by official archaeology, are gaining more traction among engineers and physicists who, far from seeking sensationalism, simply cannot find a practical explanation within traditional parameters. At the heart of it, the great mystery surrounding the unmanageable blocks of the Great Pyramid remains an open wound in historiography and archaeology. Every block, every ton of stone displaced, is an unanswered question. A question that challenges not only our understanding of past technology, but also our willingness to accept that perhaps some chapters of human history are still waiting to be written. Tools that never appeared. If there is one aspect that most clearly challenges the accepted logic about the construction of the pyramids, it is the absolute, uncomfortable, and persistent absence of the proper tools. A pyramid like the one at Khufu, built with over 2 million stone blocks, many of which are made of extremely hard granite, presents us with a technical dilemma so evident that, once discovered, it becomes impossible to stop thinking about it. Where are the tools capable of accomplishing such a feat? And more importantly, what kind of tools could have made cuts and adjustments with a level of precision that today, even with state-of-the-art industrial equipment, would require specialized machinery? The official version tells us that the ancient Egyptians used copper tools, copper chisels, stone hammers, dolerite balls. Tools that, when carefully examined for their comparative strength and hardness, are completely out of scale when compared to the properties of granite. To better understand this, let us refer to a basic concept in material science, the Mohs hardness scale. Granite has a hardness between 6 and 7 on the Mohs scale, while copper barely reaches 3. This means that any attempt to carve or cut granite with copper would result, in practice, in a rapid wear of the tools, a frustrating inefficiency, and a prolonged technical impossibility over time. Over more than 2 centuries of systematic excavations at the Giza Plateau and other related archaeological sites, only a few copper tools have been found, along with corroded fragments and little else. There are no workshops, no tool deposits, no piles of worn-out implements one would expect to find in a project of such scale and duration. There is no evidence of the thousands of hammers, chisels, and saws that, according to the traditional explanation, would have been essential. Any modern construction, even the humblest, leaves behind tangible remnants of the tools used. But here, in one of the most colossal works in human history, the archaeological void is practically complete. In recent years, some archaeologists have attempted to fill this void through experimental archaeology. Controlled tests have been carried out to try cutting granite using copper tools similar to those the Egyptians would have had. The results are always the same. After hours of exhausting work, the progress in the stone is minimal, if not zero. The tools deform, bend, and break. Even when sharpened or hardened through basic thermal processes, their capacity remains clearly insufficient to produce clean and straight cuts, like those found in many of the blocks of the Great Pyramid. On other occasions, it has been suggested that they used sand as an abrasive, combined with water and manual effort. The technique of abrasion with sand is real and documented in some historical contexts, but it raises new problems. To cut a single block of granite by abrasion would require a disproportionate amount of time and effort, far more than what would allow for a construction schedule that, according to official estimates, did not exceed 27 years. The logistics of repeating this process with thousands of massive blocks simply do not add up. Additionally, even in these experiments, the final finish is far from the perfection seen in the original cuts. Another common argument in defense of the traditional version is that perhaps the tools simply haven't survived over time. That copper, being a material prone to corrosion, may have degraded until it disappeared. This explanation, though seemingly logical, is fragile when considering the immense number of other copper tools and objects that have been preserved in much less favorable archaeological contexts. There are punches, blades, and copper ornaments that have withstood millennia, found in tombs and settlements throughout Egypt. If these objects managed to survive, why has not even a tiny fraction of the supposed instruments that would have shaped millions of tons of stone been found? But the enigma of the tools goes far beyond their simple physical absence. There are marks, cuts, and polished surfaces in the granite of the pyramids and other Egyptian monuments that show characteristics of advanced machining. Parallel channels, perfectly straight cutting lines, and internal angles that, under normal conditions, are only achieved today with industrial circular saws or wire-cutting machinery. Even microscopic traces have been detected suggesting continuous rotary movements, something impossible to achieve with manual and rudimentary techniques. Some engineers who have had the opportunity to study these marks in detail, such as Christopher Dunn, a specialist in precision manufacturing, have concluded that the methods employed must have involved a level of technical control that defies the traditional understanding of ancient Egyptian technology. Dunn, after analyzing various samples and conducting comparative studies, suggested that the traces found in certain granite blocks could only have been produced with high-speed cutting tools and a constant, powerful energy source. Naturally, these types of approaches are not well received by the official archaeological community. Theories suggesting the existence of lost technologies or even the influence of knowledge that does not fit within the accepted chronology are automatically relegated to the realm of pseudoscience. But the reality is that, beyond the controversies and labels, the problem of the tools remains unresolved. The archaeological void, coupled with the visible physical evidence in the blocks, presents a challenge that cannot be ignored or reduced to a matter of faith in the traditional version. Some more conservative sectors have tried to close the topic by appealing to human ingenuity, to the human ability to solve problems with the means at hand. And of course, no one can doubt that ability. History is full of examples of creativity and technical overcoming, but even the most prodigious inventiveness needs the right tools, durable materials, and efficient methods. No civilization, no matter how advanced for its time, has ever been able to defy the basic laws of physics and material resistance. The enigma of the tools that never appeared goes beyond a simple archaeological problem. It forces us to question not only how the pyramids were built, but how much we truly know about the technological history of ancient civilizations. Perhaps in some corner of Egypt still waiting to be discovered lies the definitive answer. Perhaps beneath the sands or under layers of sediment rest the remains of workshops and forges that will completely change our understanding of the past. But until that day arrives, the mystery will remain, as immense and heavy as the very granite blocks that continue to challenge our understanding, century after century. The silence of the hieroglyphs. One of the most baffling yet revealing aspects of the mystery surrounding the Egyptian pyramids is the complete lack of written, engraved, or depicted testimonies explaining their construction process. What's even more curious is that we are talking about a civilization that, by tradition and cultural obsession, recorded practically everything. The ancient Egyptians wrote about agriculture, hunting, religious rituals, medical procedures, the administration of temples, and even the beer rations distributed among the workers. Their walls, tombs, stelae, and temples are like open books to the past. Every aspect of their daily life was immortalized in stone, papyrus, reliefs, and paintings. But when it comes time to look for graphical representations or texts documenting the construction of the Great Pyramid, the void is absolute. The Giza Plateau is filled with monuments covered in inscriptions that narrate military deeds, conquest campaigns, offerings to the gods, or the afterlife. There are reliefs showing how bodies were embalmed, how wheat was harvested, or how religious festivals were celebrated. But not a single hieroglyph describes how thousands of blocks weighing several tons were cut, transported, and assembled to build what, for almost 4,000 years, was the tallest structure ever erected by mankind. This documentary absence becomes even stranger when one stops to think about the scale and importance that, in theory, the construction of Khufu's pyramid must have had. If it was really erected by the order of a pharaoh aiming to immortalize himself, why are there no grand murals with heroic scenes of its raising? Where are the lists of architects, the tributes to the foremen, the accounts of the challenges overcome, or the offerings dedicated to those who worked on the project? In other royal and noble tombs, even from earlier and later periods, the much smaller works they ordered to be built are detailed. However, in the case of the Great Pyramid, the most emblematic of all, silence reigns. Some Egyptologists have tried to explain this absence by suggesting that maybe the written records of its construction existed at one time, but were destroyed by the passage of time or by looters. However, this hypothesis does not hold up when considering that numerous contemporary inscriptions, in sites far more exposed and vulnerable, have survived for millennia in less favorable conditions. Temples, mastabas, and much older funerary chambers still retain visible inscriptions, making it hard to believe that a project as monumental as the Great Pyramid would have no written representation whatsoever. It has also been suggested that perhaps the pyramid was built in a different cultural context, during a stage prior to the standardization of hieroglyphic records. But this explanation doesn't fully fit either. Hieroglyphs already existed in Egypt long before the time of Khufu. The earliest forms of Egyptian writing date back more than 300 years before the supposed date of the Great Pyramid's construction. In fact, by the time Khufu ascended the throne, Egypt already had an established bureaucracy and a well-established tradition of administrative and religious documentation. What's most striking is that in other smaller Egyptian architectural projects, references to construction do appear. Reliefs have been found showing the carving and transportation of statues, the erection of obelisks, and even the process of making mud bricks for smaller structures. There are scenes depicting workers dragging heavy objects, using sledges, and pouring water to reduce friction. However, on the pyramids of Giza, the official iconography remains mute. Even the funerary texts, which often record the most important feats and achievements of the pharaoh, are strangely silent on this matter. In Khufu's tomb, if we assume that the Great Pyramid was truly his tomb, there are no inscriptions proclaiming his authorship. Neither in the walls of the inner chambers, nor in the supposed mortuary rooms, do we find hymns or accounts praising the construction of the monument. When compared with other royal tombs, where the decoration and inscriptions are abundant and explicit, the difference is striking. It's as if the construction process never occurred within the historical framework we know. The more critical archaeologists and independent researchers see this silence as one of the strongest clues that the Great Pyramid may not belong to the period it is officially placed in. Some argue that the monument could have been built by a previous, much older civilization, whose historical record has been completely lost, or that perhaps never used hieroglyphic writing as we understand it today. This theory, though controversial, gained strength precisely due to the accumulation of gaps and inconsistencies in the archaeological documentation. It's also important not to forget the political context of Egyptian history. During the centuries following the supposed construction of the Great Pyramid, Egypt experienced multiple periods of instability, invasions, and changes of power. However, other constructions of lesser relevance managed to preserve their historical records, which weakens the idea that all the documentary material related to the pyramids disappeared by chance or through natural deterioration. On some occasions, the existence of small graffiti or mason's marks found in the upper areas of the Great Pyramid, accessible only after its modern opening, has been considered sufficient. These inscriptions, which include names of work crews and references to Khufu, have been used as arguments to reaffirm the official authorship. But even accepting these graffiti as authentic and not later additions, they still don't explain the monumental absence of formal and elaborate inscriptions that would logically be found in such a massive project. The lack of detailed texts on the construction of the pyramids is also reflected in later Egyptian art. For centuries, artists depicted in temples and tombs scenes of all aspects of life and death. But the process of building a pyramid, the mass transport of blocks, or the coordination of thousands of workers never appeared as a theme in reliefs or paintings. The pyramid is present in the landscape, but absent from the narrative. This silence, rather than a mere omission, begins to look like a kind of deliberate erasure in historical memory, a sort of blank space that no one dared to fill. And if there is one thing that the history of civilizations teaches us, it is that when such a gap persists, it is rarely due to simple neglect. The mystery of the missing hieroglyphs is a direct invitation to question everything we think we know about the chronology and authorship of the pyramids. The lack of inscriptions about the construction is not an archaeological coincidence nor a simple hole in the documentary record. It is an anomaly as great as the stones that make up the Great Pyramid. And in the world of historical enigmas, anomalies are always the beginning of the most important questions. Are they really from Khufu? Over the centuries, the story of the Great Pyramid of Giza has been almost indisputably linked to the pharaoh Khufu. In every history book, every television documentary, and every tourist brochure one can find, the attribution to this monarch of Egypt's fourth dynasty seems like an absolute, unquestionable truth, established as an archaeological dogma that no one seems willing to publicly question. But it only takes scratching the surface of this supposed historical certainty for doubts to begin to appear, conceptual cracks that open the door to a much deeper debate. The question, therefore, is not only whether Khufu was responsible for ordering the construction, but whether there are truly solid proofs that allow us to affirm this with the certainty that we have often been sold. The first thing that stands out is that within the very structure of the Great Pyramid, there is no formal inscription, neither on the walls nor in the interior chambers, identifying Khufu as the builder. There is no plaque carved into the stone, no elaborate and permanent hieroglyph that pays tribute to his supposed architectural feat. In Egyptian funerary tradition, where the cult of immortality and the perpetuation of the pharaoh's name were central elements, this absence is as puzzling as it is significant. The ancient Egyptians' obsession with ensuring that the king's name remained inscribed through time was so strong that it is hard to accept that in their most important monument, the largest of all pyramids, there is no official trace of his identity. The only direct link between Khufu and the Great Pyramid comes from a controversial discovery that, despite its lack of conclusiveness, has been repeated ad nauseum as the definitive proof. The famous red paint marks discovered in 1837 by British Colonel Richard Vyse. According to his own testimony, during his excavations, Vyse accessed upper chambers, now known as the relieving chambers, where he found, among other inscriptions, Khufu's name written in hieroglyphs. These marks, which were never carved into the stone but simply painted, are the only internal evidence that associates the pharaoh with the pyramid. However, from the moment of their discovery, this find has been surrounded by controversy. Numerous researchers have pointed out that Vyse, under immense pressure to justify the funding for his excavations, and fearing returning to England empty-handed, may have manipulated or even fabricated those inscriptions. There are documents and field journals showing inconsistencies in the dates and in the way the chambers were opened and explored. Additionally, several Egyptologists and hieroglyphic experts have highlighted irregularities in the writing that do not fully align with the handwriting from Khufu's time. Even more unsettling is the fact that to this day, Vyse's marks have never been subjected to independent scientific dating through modern methods, such as pigment analysis or carbon studies on the organic remains in the paint. The Egyptian authorities' refusal to allow such studies has only raised more suspicions. If they are truly authentic, why not allow science to certify them definitively? If we take a step back and observe the broader archaeological context, the picture remains murky. No royal tomb containing Khufu's mummy has been found near the pyramid, nor any funerary goods, nor a sarcophagus that can be unequivocally linked to him. The so-called King's Chamber, located inside the pyramid, contains an empty, inscriptionless sarcophagus. Its design is simple, made of granite, but completely lacking the ritual and decorative elements that characterize the royal tombs of other pharaohs. All this suggests that perhaps this place was never conceived as a tomb, or, if it ever housed a body, that body was not Khufu's. Classical texts, such as Herodotus's account, are another source of confusion. Written 2,000 years after the supposed construction of the Great Pyramid, Herodotus's testimony mixes legends, rumors, and oral reports. According to his version, Khufu was a tyrannical ruler who forced his people to work on the pyramid for decades, even resorting to extremes of desecration and corruption to finance his project. However, given the time gap between Herodotus and the events he describes, his account lacks probative value and only adds more confusion. Another argument often put forth in favor of Khufu's authorship is the chronological correspondence. The pyramid is archaeologically placed within the 4th dynasty, so many assume that it must have been he who ordered it. But this is an inference built more on the lack of alternative candidates than on positive evidence. While it is true that there are stelae and administrative records from later periods that mention Khufu as an important pharaoh, none of these sources directly link him to the Giza pyramid. The connection is, at best, circumstantial. Some alternative researchers have proposed that the Great Pyramid could be much older than Khufu. They base their argument on erosion studies in the Giza Plateau, astronomical alignments that do not correspond to the 4th dynasty period, and the absence of internal inscriptions. According to this line of thought, Khufu may have found the pyramid already built and simply appropriated it, either as a symbol of power or as a secondary tomb. This hypothesis, though not without criticism, would at least have the virtue of more logically explaining the puzzling documentary void. The issue of dating also adds uncertainty. The few carbon dating samples taken from organic materials found in the pyramid yielded disparate results, with margins of error spanning several centuries. And it should be remembered that these datings do not correspond to the stone, which cannot be carbon dated, but rather to wood residues or organic materials found between the blocks, which introduces a considerable margin for speculation. In the end, when one looks at the whole body of evidence, beyond the media repetition of the official narrative, what remains is a vast hole of evidence. There is no administrative documentation that records the construction, no graphic representations, no funerary texts dedicated to Khufu inside the pyramid, and the only direct link is reduced to a few painted marks whose authenticity has never been independently verified. The great problem here is that modern archaeological history, in its eagerness to close chapters and establish clear dates in textbooks, has built a narrative that relies more on the need to offer quick answers than on a critical and rigorous analysis of the evidence. And the consequence of all this is that we continue to accept as an irrefutable fact a claim that, under scrutiny by logic and evidence, has more flaws than many are willing to admit. The link between Khufu and the Great Pyramid is, today, more a matter of archaeological tradition than scientific certainty. A story that, no matter how often it is repeated, remains a construct in desperate need of a deep and impartial revision, because as long as there is no solid evidence, the question will remain in the air, floating between the granite blocks and the desert sands. Who really built the Great Pyramid of Giza? The Diary of Mirror. Proof or manipulation? In recent decades, few archaeological finds have been presented with as much enthusiasm and certainty as the so-called Diary of Mirror. For many, this document is seen as the cornerstone that confirms the official version that the pyramids, or at least the Great Pyramid of Giza, were built under the orders of Khufu, following a meticulously planned and executed scheme. The story, as it has been disseminated in the media and specialized publications, seems convincing at first glance. An ancient site supervisor, a man named Merer, recorded his daily activities on papyri that miraculously survived over 4,000 years, detailing the transportation of limestone blocks to the Giza Plateau. However, as is often the case with many elements surrounding this subject, the reality behind the discovery is far from being as solid and conclusive as we are led to believe. The discovery of the Diary of Mirror took place in 2013 when a team of French archaeologists, led by Pierre Tallet, explored the galleries of Wadi al-Jarf, an ancient port on the Red Sea coast. There, among pottery remains and tools, a set of papyri was found that was notably well preserved for its age. The discovery was, without a doubt, one of the most important in decades within the field of Egyptology, as it represented the oldest known administrative documents to date. Within these papyri, the name of Merer appears repeatedly. According to the texts, he was a mid-ranking official tasked with coordinating the transport of limestone blocks from the quarries of Tura, located to the east of the Nile, to a place called Khufu. This phrase is generally translated as the horizon of Khufu, a reference that has been interpreted as a clear allusion to the Great Pyramid. Therefore, many archaeologists and media outlets quickly jump to the conclusion that the Diary of Merer is the first and only direct evidence that the Pyramid of Khufu was built during the reign of this pharaoh. But when one takes the time to read the official translations of the papyrus carefully, nuances begin to emerge that, for some reason, almost never appear in the headlines. The first thing that stands out is that Merer's text never describes the actual process of pyramid construction. There are no references to the placement of blocks, nor to transportation systems within the Giza plateau, nor to the technique of assembling the stones. The only thing mentioned is the transport of limestone blocks, a material primarily used for the exterior casing, from Tura to somewhere near the pyramid. This means that, at best, the diary only documents a very specific part of the process, the river transport of a particular type of stone. And what is even more revealing is that the white limestone casing that once covered the pyramid has nearly disappeared today. What remains are the internal layers of coarser stone, made of a more abundant local material, whose extraction and transport are not mentioned at all in the Diary of Merer. Another controversial aspect is the way the discovery was presented to the world. The first reports came wrapped in an air of mystery, with carefully selected images and no immediate access granted to the international community for the original documents. For months, only a few specialists had the opportunity to review the full texts, while the general public had to make do with excerpts, partial photographs, and official statements. This initial lack of transparency inevitably aroused suspicion among those who have been questioning the official version of the pyramid's construction for years. The very process of translating and contextualizing the diary has also been criticized. Some independent experts in hieroglyphic writing and ancient Egyptian have pointed out that the interpretation of certain passages can be more flexible than is often admitted. For example, identifying Khufu as a direct synonym of the Great Pyramid is a deduction, not a literal statement contained in the text. Khufu was the name of a broader funerary complex, and its exact location within the context of the time can be subject to different readings. This ambiguity, however, is rarely conveyed to the general public. The dating of the document is another delicate issue. The papyri were dated to approximately the 27th year of Khufu's reign, which theoretically places them at the height of the construction of the Great Pyramid. But the dating of papyri in archaeological contexts always has margins of error, especially when the documents were found outside the area where the events they describe are supposed to have occurred. In this case, the distance between Wadi al-Jarf and Giza exceeds 180 kilometers, which adds a layer of geographical disconnection that is rarely discussed in depth. Moreover, there is one detail that many overlook. Wadi al-Jarf was a port for commercial and logistical operations for Egyptian trade with the Sinai Peninsula and other regions of the Red Sea. The movement of materials into the country from there was common, leaving open the possibility that the transport of limestone was not exclusively related to the Pyramid of Khufu, but rather to other contemporary projects, or even later maintenance phases. As if this were not enough, the media coverage of the discovery has tended to oversimplify the content of the Diary of Merer, almost without nuance, turning it into the definitive proof that closes the debate about the authorship of the pyramid. The repetition of this interpretation in documentaries, articles, and educational programs has ended up reinforcing a narrative that, in reality, has more to do with interested interpretation than with irrefutable evidence. Those who have investigated the case in depth, such as some critical historians and independent Egyptologists, warn that the Diary of Merer, though valuable as testimony of the Egyptian administration of the time, is far from being the final piece of the puzzle. Its content, rather than providing a definitive answer, opens up new questions about the logistics, the organization of labor, and the true purpose of the materials transported. At its core, what the Diary of Mira represents is yet another example of how, in the field of archaeology, a piece of partial information can be amplified and turned into dogma without undergoing a thorough review process. The need to validate an official version, the interest in generating attractive headlines, and the resistance to accepting that there are still enormous gaps in our understanding of ancient Egypt have turned this document into an unquestionable banner. But as with every piece of this gigantic historical puzzle, the Diary of Mira does not provide absolute certainties. On the contrary, its careful reading and critical analysis remind us once again that the mystery of the pyramids remains as solid and immovable as the stone blocks that compose them. Because in the world of archaeology, a single voice is not enough to silence all the questions that history continues to shout in silence, man. Secret tunnels beneath Giza. If there is a place where the mysteries of ancient times seem to accumulate like geological layers, that place is undoubtedly the Giza Plateau. Beneath the imposing silhouette of the pyramids lies an underground network that has remained in the shadows of official archaeology for decades. While television cameras and tourists focus on the majesty of the visible structures, beneath their feet lies a hidden world, a labyrinth of tunnels, passageways, chambers, and conduits whose existence is gradually coming to light. And as is often the case in such matters, what emerges is not a definitive explanation, but a series of new questions that challenge what we thought we knew. The first mentions of tunnels and cavities beneath the Giza Plateau are not recent. As early as the 19th century, explorers like Howard Weiss and Auguste Mariette documented underground passages, chambers carved into the rock, and conduits whose purpose no one could fully explain. However, these early records were relegated to the background, as if the interest in what lay beneath the pyramids was less important than studying the monumental structures themselves. Over time, some of these tunnels were explored, but many others remained sealed or inaccessible to the public. For years, rumors about hidden chambers and unidentified underground levels persisted, fueled by the testimonies of independent explorers and local workers who claimed that the plateau concealed more than met the eye. The situation changed significantly in 2015 when the international project known as Scan Pyramids, led by Cairo University and the HIP Institute of France, began applying cutting-edge technologies to study the pyramids without the need to drill or damage them. Using a combination of infrared thermography, muon tomography, and ground-penetrating radar scans, the researchers were able to obtain unprecedented images of the interior of the structures and, more importantly, the land beneath them. The results quickly generated a seismic shift in the archaeological community. One of the most discussed discoveries was the detection of a large hidden cavity above the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid, a space whose function and access are still unknown. But beyond this chamber, the real focus shifted to the underground. The scans revealed anomalies in the density of the ground, hollow areas suggesting the existence of buried chambers and tunnels branching in different directions. Some of these cavities appear to be of natural origin, but others have right angles, flat ceilings, and proportions that are difficult to explain as spontaneous geological formations. The existence of these tunnels has revived ancient theories that were dismissed by official archaeology for years as mere speculation. Some researchers have been suggesting for decades that the Giza Plateau could house an underground network designed for ritual, astronomical, or even technological purposes. There are those who claim that these tunnels could connect the three main pyramids, or even extend to the nearby Sphinx, another of Egypt's great enigmas that seems to hide its own secrets beneath the earth. The Sphinx, in particular, has been the subject of special interest in this context. Various studies conducted with ground-penetrating radar have shown the presence of cavities just beneath its paws and at the back. Despite this, permits for excavations in those areas have been systematically denied by Egyptian authorities, further fueling suspicions about what might truly be hidden down there. The few permitted explorations have been conducted with controlled teams and under strict government supervision, with no participation from independent researchers. Some proponents of alternative theories suggest that these tunnels could be much older than the pyramids themselves. They base this assertion on the style of excavation, the wear on the rock walls, and the geographical alignments that seem to follow an unknown pattern. According to these hypotheses, the Giza Plateau may have been, thousands of years before the pharaonic ancient Egypt, a ceremonial or even technological center, the remains of which are now buried and forgotten. Of course, the more orthodox scientific community has responded to these claims with skepticism. It is argued that most of the cavities are simply water extraction wells, ancient storage rooms, or unfinished burial chambers. It is also suggested that many of the anomalies detected by the scanners could be flaws in the rock's density, caused by tectonic movements or underground erosion. However, this generic explanation falls short when one observes the geometric arrangement of some of these cavities. The angles, regular dimensions, and orientation of certain tunnels suggest an intentional design, the result of deliberate architectural planning. The lack of public access to many of these underground areas has created an atmosphere of suspicion. Independent research groups have repeatedly requested permits to conduct their own measurements, but official responses have always been negative. In this context, it is not surprising that hypotheses about possible cover-ups are circulating, about the existence of chambers that contain findings uncomfortable to the traditional narrative of Egyptology, or even about the presence of technology or knowledge of unknown origin. On the other hand, there are unofficial testimonies from local workers and former excavation employees who claim to have seen blocked passages, descending stairs disappearing into the darkness, and rooms to which access is absolutely prohibited. These accounts, while impossible to verify independently, help keep alive the suspicion that beneath the Giza Plateau lies more than just simple rock. The possibility that these tunnels conceal undiscovered burial chambers, stores of ancient texts, or even forgotten technologies is an idea that is increasingly garnering interest, even in academic circles that once dismissed these matters with disdain. Modern technology has proven to be a powerful ally for archaeology, but it has also made it clear that the information obtained can be manipulated and disclosed selectively. The case of the secret tunnels beneath Giza presents us with a fascinating dilemma. On one hand, we have tools capable of unveiling hidden structures several meters deep without the need for a single shovel. On the other hand, there is an evident institutional resistance to delving into these discoveries or sharing them transparently with the international community. The combination of these two realities has caused the mystery, rather than being solved, to grow with each new study, each scan, each partial report that is published. In the end, what remains is the certainty that beneath the surface of Giza lies something more, something that has remained hidden for thousands of years, and that perhaps we are still not ready to discover. And in the meantime, the tunnels remain there, waiting, as if they were the hidden arteries of an ancient body that still has much to tell. Alignment with the stars. If there is one aspect of the pyramids that evokes both awe and confusion among archaeologists, astronomers, and independent researchers, it is their mysterious and almost perfect alignment with the sky. The relationship between the monumental structures of the Giza Plateau and the stars in the sky has been studied for decades, and far from providing definitive answers. Each analysis raises new questions about the level of astronomical knowledge possessed by their builders, and the true intentions behind the design of these colossal edifices. The precision with which the pyramids are oriented toward the cardinal points is the first detail that draws attention. The Great Pyramid, in particular, shows a deviation of only 3 arc minutes from true north. This margin of error is so small that it is practically insignificant, even when compared to some modern constructions. Achieving such an exact alignment would have been extremely complex, even for today's engineers, if they had to do it without the help of digital compasses, GPS systems, or laser technology. Yet we are talking about a structure built, according to the official chronology, over 4,500 years ago, by a civilization that supposedly had no precision measurement instruments. There are various theories that attempt to explain how they achieved this orientation. Some researchers argue that the ancient Egyptians may have used the position of certain circumpolar stars, such as Kochab and Mizar, to establish a reliable astronomical north. Others suggest they might have employed methods based on solar shadowing and the observation of the solstices. However, even considering these techniques, the accuracy achieved in the case of the Great Pyramid remains difficult to explain with the tools known from the era. It is as if the builders had access to a level of astronomical and technological understanding far superior to what is officially attributed to them. But cardinal orientation is not the only enigma. In the late 1990s, engineer and writer Robert Bauval proposed a hypothesis that would completely change the way we understand the design of the Giza pyramids. After years of study, Bauval noticed that the relative arrangement of the three main pyramids corresponded geometrically with the position of the three stars that form Orion's belt, known as Al-Nitak, Al-Nilam, and Mintaka. The match was not exact to 100%, but it was close enough to consider the possibility that the pyramid builders used the Orion constellation as a reference in their design of the complex. Bauval's theory, known as the Orion correlation, was supported by some astronomers who conducted stellar simulations to see how the sky over Egypt would have appeared around 2500 BC. The results were revealing. At that time, due to the phenomenon of the precession of the equinoxes, Orion's belt would have appeared in the night sky with an orientation and position that nearly perfectly matched the layout of the pyramids on the ground. Furthermore, the Milky Way would have aligned with the course of the Nile, reinforcing the symbolic connection between heaven and earth. This discovery led to a new approach in the study of the pyramids. It was no longer just about questioning how they were built, but also about asking why they were erected according to a cosmic pattern. The Egyptian culture, like many other ancient civilizations, placed enormous importance on astronomy. The god Osiris, directly associated with the Orion constellation, was considered the lord of the afterlife, the symbol of rebirth and immortality. This is why some researchers suggest that the pyramids were not simply monumental tombs, but symbolic or energetic portals intended to facilitate the pharaoh's journey to the stars, to his eternal union with the gods. The alignments are not limited only to the horizontal arrangement of the pyramids. There are internal shafts within the Great Pyramid that appear to have been designed with very specific astronomical intentions. One of them, for example, points directly to the pole star of the time, known as Thuban, while another is oriented toward the Orion constellation. These channels, whose practical function still generates debate, reinforce the idea that the structure was conceived with a direct relationship to the heavens in mind. Even the dimensions of the pyramid seem to contain astronomical and mathematical references. Some researchers have pointed out that if you multiply the original height of the Great Pyramid by a specific factor, the result equals the average distance between the Earth and the Sun, a detail that, if confirmed, would suggest an astronomical knowledge of a depth nearly impossible to attain for a Bronze Age culture. Of course, traditional archaeology has attempted to offer rational explanations for these alignments. Some scholars argue that any coincidence with Orion's belt could be the result of chance or human perception, which tends to find patterns even where none exist. Others suggest that the builders were simply seeking a symbolic alignment with the north, and that any other relationship is a modern overinterpretation. However, there is something about this whole matter that escapes coincidence. When considering the cardinal orientation, the arrangement of the pyramids, the inclination of the internal shafts, and the astronomical references present in other Egyptian monuments, the emerging pattern seems too precise and repetitive to be the result of improvisation or a mere aesthetic whim. The theory of stellar alignment not only raises doubts about the ancient Egyptians' astronomical knowledge, but also opens the door to much more uncomfortable questions. If we accept that the pyramids were designed based on the position of the stars, where did they obtain that knowledge? The precession of the equinoxes, for example, is a phenomenon that takes over 25,000 years to complete a cycle, which implies long-term observation or the possession of extremely advanced mathematical calculations. Could we then be looking at the legacy of a previous civilization whose understanding of the cosmos far surpassed that of the cultures that followed? Some bolder researchers have even suggested that this knowledge could have reached Egypt from a lost civilization, or in more speculative scenarios, that it was transmitted by entities who possessed a deeper understanding of astronomy than any known human culture at the time. For now, the only indisputable fact is that the relationship between the pyramids and the stars is an integral part of the mystery of Giza. No matter how many explanations are offered by the orthodoxy, or how many efforts are made to downplay the significance of these alignments, the evidence is there, carved in stone, pointing toward the sky, like a silent yet persistent message that continues to defy logic, history, and science. A kind of stony reminder that perhaps the true meaning of the pyramids still remains out of our reach. The pyramid as a machine. Throughout history, the pyramids of Egypt have been viewed as monumental tombs, symbols of pharaonic power, or as supreme expressions of megalithic architecture. However, in recent decades, a much bolder, more provocative, and undoubtedly more uncomfortable theory for traditional academic thought has gained traction. The possibility that the Great Pyramid of Giza was not a tomb, nor a mere monument, but a kind of machine, a structure designed to serve a technological or energy-related function, the true purpose of which, to this day, we can barely begin to imagine. It all begins when one analyzes the physical characteristics of the Great Pyramid from a perspective that goes beyond conventional architecture. The choice of location, for example, does not seem to have been accidental. The Giza Plateau is located in a region of great geological stability, sitting on a solid limestone foundation. Furthermore, the pyramid is positioned almost exactly at the geographic center of the Earth's landmass, if measured in relation to the distribution of continents and oceans. This coincidence, far from being a mere whim of nature, has led many to wonder whether the builders had knowledge of planetary geography that modern technology has only recently allowed us to map with such precision. The almost perfect alignment with the cardinal points, which we addressed earlier, seems to reinforce this suspicion of intentional design based on advanced astronomical and geodesic calculations. But there is more. The geometry of the pyramid contains a series of mathematical proportions that are not easily explained under the assumption of a civilization lacking sophisticated instruments. The ratio between the height and the perimeter, for example, approximates the value of pi. Additionally, if the original height of the pyramid is multiplied by a certain factor, the result surprisingly comes close to the average distance between the Earth and the Sun, as if someone had wanted to encode universal constants within the structure itself. These details, though fascinating, are just the surface of the mystery. When one begins to study the interior of the Great Pyramid, anomalies accumulate. The presence of chambers and shafts that have no apparent funerary purpose has been a topic of debate since the first explorations. The Grand Gallery, with its sloping shape and strange acoustic resonance, has been compared by some researchers to an energy conduit. The channels that lead from the inner chambers to the exterior, known as ventilation shafts, have astronomical alignments, but moreover, seem to serve a function that goes beyond mere air circulation. One of the most intriguing aspects involves the composition of the materials used. The various stone layers, ranging from limestone to granite, are arranged in such a way that some have suggested the pyramid could have functioned as a kind of condenser or energy generator. The king's chamber, in particular, is completely lined with granite, a material known to contain high levels of quartz, which is renowned for its piezoelectric properties. This means that when subjected to pressure or vibration, granite can generate electric charges. While this characteristic alone does not prove that the pyramid was a machine, it certainly opens an interesting door to new hypotheses. Recent experiments have explored the possibility that the structure acted as an energy resonator. Russian researchers, for example, conducted acoustic resonance studies inside the pyramid and discovered that certain sound frequencies are amplified inside in an anomalous way. The Grand Gallery and the King's Chamber, in particular, seem to act as resonance chambers, capable of concentrating and amplifying acoustic waves. This phenomenon, which occurs naturally due to the shape and dimensions of the spaces, has led some to theorize that the pyramid could have functioned as a gigantic energy resonance or transmission device. Furthermore, we must consider the enigma of the wells and underground passages. The so-called access shaft, which connects the Grand Gallery to the subterranean chamber, has features that do not entirely fit with a purely funerary design. Its abrupt path, narrowness, and orientation seem to respond more to a technical purpose than to a simple ventilation or ritual access element. The subterranean chamber, carved directly into the rock, remains undecorated and shows no signs of having housed a burial. However, its presence aligns with some theories suggesting that it could have been the center of operations for some kind of energy process. Some researchers have gone further with their hypotheses, suggesting that the pyramid may have served as a hydrogen generation system. According to this theory, water introduced through the underground channels would react with other compounds present inside, producing hydrogen gas which, as it ascended, would pass through the various chambers where, through acoustic resonance, it could have been excited and channeled in some way. This idea, though sounding close to science fiction, has been developed with fluid dynamic simulations and acoustic analyses by some engineers. Another line of research focuses on the electromagnetic properties of the pyramid. Recent models, generated by European physicists, have shown that under certain resonance conditions, the Great Pyramid could concentrate electromagnetic energy in its internal chambers. While these experiments were conducted with scale simulations, the fact that a structure built more than 4,000 years ago could act as an electromagnetic field collector is still astonishing. This possibility reopens the debate about the knowledge that the ancient Egyptians, or those who built the pyramid, may have had regarding physical phenomena that in theory they were unaware of. Of course, all these theories have been met with skepticism, if not outright hostility, from traditional archaeology. It is argued that these ideas lack sufficient empirical evidence and tend to exaggerate structural coincidences. However, the underlying problem remains the same. The pyramid, as it is built, contains an accumulation of anomalies and technical characteristics that do not fit the simplistic narrative of a funerary monument. Each new study, each new measurement, each experiment attempting to decipher the physical and energetic properties of the Great Pyramid only expands the mystery rather than closing it. The question of whether we are facing a gigantic tomb, an energy machine, or a structure designed for a purpose we still do not understand remains without a clear answer. And perhaps it is precisely this uncertainty that makes the Great Pyramid one of the most fascinating enigmas in human history. A stone presence, silent but laden with questions, that stands defiantly before those who attempt to explain it within the narrow margins of known logic. Suspicious cut marks. One of the most eloquent, yet most overlooked details by traditional archaeology are the cut marks that can still be observed today on many of the blocks that make up the pyramids and other monuments of ancient Egypt. At first glance, to the casual visitor, these marks may go unnoticed. They appear to be simple lines, inevitable traces of the carving process, common scars found in any stonework. However, if one takes a moment to stop, observe carefully, and analyze from a technical and logical perspective what these marks really imply, the perception changes entirely. Most of the blocks that make up the great structures of Giza, and especially those that form part of the inner chambers of the Great Pyramid, are made of granite from the quarries of Aswan. This is an extremely hard material, whose resistance to abrasion far exceeds that of the copper tools which, according to the official version, were used by the ancient Egyptians. What is most puzzling is the type of marks these stones exhibit. In many cases, the marks are straight, deep, and perfectly parallel cuts, as if a large and precise saw had passed through them. In other cases, the surfaces show smooth but exact curves, with a finish that approaches geometric perfection. To understand the magnitude of the problem this poses, it is necessary to consider the tools that, according to traditional Egyptology, were available at the time. The stonemasons of ancient Egypt are said to have used dolerite hammers, a rock harder than granite, along with copper chisels and sand abrasion techniques, rudimentary methods based on manual labor and extreme patience. However, anyone who has ever worked with stone knows that these procedures, although possible for small details or blocks of limited size, do not allow for the creation of straight, deep, and consistent cut lines over several meters, much less on materials as resistant as granite. In this context, it becomes impossible to ignore the analyses carried out by researchers such as Christopher Dunn, an engineer specializing in high-precision manufacturing, who has dedicated years to studying the cut marks in Egypt. Dunn has documented, with high-resolution photographs and detailed measurements, the presence of grooves that exhibit a constant depth and a spacing between striations that corresponds to what, today, could only be achieved by large-diameter disc saws or industrial abrasive cutting technologies. According to his observations, some of these cuts even show signs of having been made with continuous feed machinery, something unthinkable for the Bronze Age. The most cited example is that of the sarcophagus in the king's chamber. This solid granite piece, flawlessly hollowed out, features internal corners with perfectly right angles and polished surfaces that, even today, would require numerical control machinery to replicate with the same level of finish. When observing the inner walls of the sarcophagus, cut lines can be seen indicating the use of a material removal tool that worked at a speed and pressure that known manual techniques simply could not have generated. Another example can be found in the quarries of Aswan. There still remain unfinished granite blocks, such as the famous unfinished obelisk, which show longitudinal cuts with parallel grooves, signs of an extraction process that involved the use of a blade or tool that moved in a straight line along the stone. The regularity of these grooves has led some engineering specialists to suggest that the tool used must have been equipped with constant force and millimetric control to maintain that uniformity across the surface of the block. Beyond Egypt, if one compares these marks with those made today using technologies like diamond wire cutting or CNC milling, the similarities are striking. And this is precisely one of the major dilemmas. If the visible traces are so similar to those left by our most advanced tools, how is it possible that a civilization more than 4,000 years ago could have created them without access to such technologies? Official archaeology, for its part, has responded to these observations with arguments that border on the improbable. It has been suggested that wear from friction, combined with infinite patience and the use of abrasives such as sand, could have been enough to achieve these results. However, the calculations of time and effort needed to replicate even one of these cuts using the proposed methods are discouraging. The most conservative estimates suggest weeks or even months to cut a single line of a few meters in length through granite. And that's assuming ideal conditions, which would hardly have been present in a real working environment, with extreme temperatures, worn-out tools, and a limited labor force. The problem is further compounded if we take into account the total volume of stone worked in the Great Pyramid and other contemporary constructions. We are not talking about a few isolated blocks, but rather hundreds of thousands of tons of carved, cut, adjusted, and placed stone with a precision that continues to astonish modern engineers. Some skeptics have attempted to downplay these marks, arguing that they could have been the result of erosion processes, earth movements, or natural flaws during the extraction of the stone. But a detailed observation easily refutes these ideas. The lines are too regular, too symmetrical, too consistent to be the product of chance or the action of natural agents. The geometry of the cuts speaks of a design and controlled execution, a process in which someone knew exactly what they were doing. At this point, the inevitable question is, What kind of technology did the pyramid builders use to work the stone with such precision? And while traditional archaeology seems reluctant to explore answers outside of its comfort zone, more and more researchers are seriously considering the possibility that either a cutting technology existed that has been completely lost in the historical records, or we are looking at evidence of knowledge that came to Egypt from a source still unknown. In the end, the cut marks are like a fingerprint carved into the stone, a material clue that remains there, waiting for someone to dare to interpret it without prejudice. Because even though official theories try to explain them with unconvincing arguments, the physical evidence remains, firm and immutable, as if the builders themselves had wanted to leave a silent testimony, an indelible trace that would force us, thousands of years later, to keep asking ourselves who they really were and what they knew that we still don't. Pyramids underwater. When we think of pyramids, the image that inevitably forms in our minds is that of those massive stone structures emerging majestically from the desert under the relentless sun of Egypt. However, as archaeological research and underwater explorations progress, a reality is emerging that completely challenges this traditional imagery. There are pyramid-like structures, or at least formations with surprisingly similar geometry, that remain submerged in waters across different parts of the planet today. And what is even more intriguing is that many of them seem to be much older than the pyramids of Giza, opening a disturbing door to the possibility of advanced prehistoric civilizations whose traces remain hidden beneath the sea. One of the most emblematic cases is that of Yonaguni, a set of underwater formations located in the Ryukyu archipelago of Japan. Discovered in 1986 by the diver Kihachiro Aratake, this site has been the subject of heated debate ever since. The structures, located about 25 meters deep, show straight lines, perfectly formed steps, horizontal platforms, and 90-degree angles that, at first glance, seem impossible to explain as mere geological whims. Supporters of the artificial hypothesis argue that these formations were originally a type of ceremonial or urban complex built by an unknown civilization that disappeared after a cataclysm. The dating of the sediment layers at Yonaguni has led some geologists to suggest that these structures may have been submerged at the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. This date, which would place us in a period before any officially recognized civilization, has been used by alternative researchers like Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch to fuel the theory that an advanced global culture existed long before the emergence of the great civilizations we know. But Yonaguni is not the only submerged enigma. Off the coast of Cuba, in an area known as the Yucatan Platform, an exploration team led by engineer Paulina Zelitsky discovered, in the early 2000s, a series of geometric formations over 600 meters deep. According to sonar scans and images obtained by underwater robots, what appeared to be an irregular seafloor turned out to contain symmetrical structures, including aligned stone blocks, possible staircases, and pyramid-like shapes. The images are blurry, and physical access to the area remains extremely complicated, but the available evidence is enough to keep the controversy alive. In the Cuban case, the depth at which the structures are located poses an even greater challenge for conventional archaeology. If they were indeed built by human hands, the last time that area was above sea level was more than 12,000 years ago, a period when, according to official history, humanity had barely begun to abandon a nomadic lifestyle. The time discrepancy is so vast that, if the artificiality of these formations is confirmed, we would be facing a discovery capable of completely rewriting what we know about the development of human civilization. Another example, perhaps lesser known but equally enigmatic, is that of the formations found in Rock Lake in Wisconsin, United States. There, beneath the waters of a freshwater lake, a structure presenting pyramid-like characteristics has been identified, and its origins have yet to be satisfactorily explained. The lack of deep archaeological explorations in the area has meant that this case hasn't received the same media attention as Yonaguni or Cuba. But for alternative researchers, it is another link in a chain of anomalies that seem to repeat in different parts of the world. The recurrence of pyramid-like shapes underwater raises inevitable questions about their meaning. Are we looking at an architectural pattern that repeats because it answers a universal functional need? Or is there a cultural connection between these geographically distant points, a kind of global architectural legacy that predates the historically recognized cultures? Some theorists go further and propose the possibility that these submerged pyramids are remnants of the legendary Atlantis or other civilizations described in ancient myths and legends. Plato himself, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, spoke of an advanced civilization that would have disappeared under the waters in a single day and night of catastrophes. Although most modern historians consider these accounts to be philosophical allegories, the growing number of underwater structures with specific architectural features makes some begin to wonder if there is some truth behind these stories. In scientific terms, the study of these structures faces obvious limitations. Underwater explorations are expensive, technically complicated, and in many cases, politically sensitive. Some of the most promising sites are located in areas of difficult access or restricted jurisdiction, which limits the work of independent researchers and encourages a lack of transparency. The absence of controlled excavations and the scarcity of in-depth analysis only fuel speculation further, but they also maintain the sense that we are merely seeing the tip of an archaeological iceberg. Another element that cannot be overlooked is the indirect but provocative relationship some establish between these underwater pyramids and those of Egypt. The question hanging in the air is whether these constructions could form part of the same global cultural pattern. The presence of pyramids in America, Asia, Africa, and now underwater suggests the possibility that the architectural and astronomical knowledge that allowed their construction was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of an older legacy, perhaps passed down through generations during a time we can barely conceive today. Geologists, for their part, remain divided. While some argue that all these structures are the result of natural formations, others admit that there are features in several of them that require much deeper investigation before conclusions are drawn. The overly regular shape of certain angles, the symmetry of platforms, and the orientation of the steps are characteristics that, while not enough to confirm human intervention, are hard to ignore when observing the entire set objectively. The debate about the pyramids underwater remains open and will likely continue for a long time. For now, the only indisputable fact is that these findings force us to broaden our perspective, question the official chronology, and consider the possibility that the history of humanity is much more complex and extensive than we have been told. The waters will continue to hide their secrets, but each new exploration, each new scan, and each blurry image emerging from the depths reminds us that perhaps, beneath the surface, lies an essential part of our lost memory. The Academic Taboo. When one delves into the serious and profound study of the pyramids of Egypt, especially the Great Pyramid of Giza, it soon becomes apparent that there exists an invisible boundary, a kind of line drawn in the sand that no one within the academic world seems willing to cross. This boundary has no sign to announce it, nor a code of conduct to explain it, but it is real and palpable to anyone who dares to ask uncomfortable questions or present theories that challenge the traditional narrative. We are talking about a phenomenon that goes far beyond simple scientific skepticism. We refer to what many independent researchers and curious minds bluntly call the academic taboo. Egyptology, like any other scientific discipline, should be based on the principle of constant questioning, the tireless search for truth, and the periodic review of evidence in light of new discoveries or more advanced technologies. However, in practice, the study of the pyramids and other archaeological enigmas seems to resemble more of a closed, dogmatic system than an open field for debate. Any hypothesis that deviates from the official version is viewed almost as an intellectual heresy, and those who dare to ask different questions are automatically and often unfairly labeled as pseudoscientists or charlatans. This phenomenon has deep roots that go far beyond the strictly academic. Egyptian archaeology, and especially anything related to Giza, is subject to tight institutional control. Egyptian authorities, led for decades by figures like Zahi Hawass, have imposed an extremely restrictive access policy to the sites, chambers, and original documents. Permits to conduct excavations, take measurements, or even simple photographic studies within the pyramids are granted sparingly and under very specific conditions. Those who receive authorization are, in most cases, researchers aligned with the official line, creating a vicious cycle where only what fits with the previously established narrative is published and disseminated. The problem worsens when one examines how scientific publications and international conferences treat alternative theories. The most prestigious academic journals simply do not accept articles that directly challenge the chronology or authorship of the pyramids. Reviewers for these outlets, often colleagues and close collaborators, carefully filter out any content that might question the foundations of traditional Egyptology. The result is a kind of forced consensus, where dissent is not met with arguments, but with editorial silence and institutional marginalization. There are documented cases of researchers who, after presenting evidence or analyses that did not fit the official discourse, were removed from their positions, banned from conferences, or outright discredited in the media. Some, like Robert Bauval with his theory of the Orion correlation, or Christopher Dunn with his studies on cutting marks, have been the target of smear campaigns that have little to do with science and much to do with defending established interests. But the academic taboo does not only manifest in the denial of new ideas. It is also evident in the way findings that could change the course of official history are interpreted or minimized. The chambers discovered by the Scan Pyramids mission, for example, were announced with great media anticipation, but to date, authorities have not allowed physical access to them. There is talk of the need for further studies, the protection of heritage, scientific caution, but beneath it all, what many suspect is a deep fear of what might be found there. This attitude of systematic resistance has very clear consequences. The first is that the general public continues to receive a version of events presented as indisputable, when in reality it is full of gaps, contradictions, and dark areas. The second, and more serious, is that the opportunity to expand human knowledge is lost, to discover new truths that could enrich our understanding of history. Some argue that this blockade is the result of a combination of factors: academic pride, fear of ridicule, protection of professional careers, and even, in some cases, political and economic interests. The Great Pyramid and everything surrounding it are a massive tourist and cultural engine for Egypt. Drastically altering the official narrative would involve rewriting textbooks, changing tourist itineraries, and facing questions that perhaps don't have simple answers. Another element that fuels this taboo is the way the media treats news related to the pyramids. Any discovery, no matter how small, is presented to the public in a sensationalistic manner, but always within the acceptable margins for the traditional narrative. The possibility that the pyramids are much older than we believe, or that they were built with technologies we do not yet understand, rarely receives serious treatment in mainstream press. Instead, these ideas are relegated to mystery documentaries or entertainment programs, reinforcing the perception that they are part of folklore, rather than a legitimate scientific discussion. However, the growing access to information and the emergence of independent platforms have allowed more and more people to begin questioning this sort of intellectual siege. The number of books, lectures, and articles that address the topic from alternative perspectives has grown significantly in recent years. Even some young academics, less conditioned by the weight of traditional structures, are beginning to show interest in reviewing certain evidence with a more open perspective. The academic taboo surrounding the pyramids is, ultimately, a reflection of a broader battle between two ways of understanding science and knowledge. On one side, there is the view that defends the stability of paradigms, control of the narrative, and resistance to the unknown. On the other, a current that advocates for curiosity, permanent questioning, and the courage to admit that perhaps, as hard as it is to accept, we still know very little about our past. The Great Pyramid of Giza, with its immovable stones and impenetrable silence, remains there, challenging those who try to confine it within comfortable and predictable explanations. And as long as questions continue to be silenced, the mystery will only grow, like a crack that sooner or later will break through the wall of academic indifference. Modern engineers, we can't replicate it. There comes a point in the life of anyone who has shown even a passing interest in the mystery of the Egyptian pyramids when an inevitable question arises, one that is almost impossible to ignore. If, with all the current technology, state-of-the-art machinery, structural design software, cranes capable of lifting hundreds of tons, and a profound understanding of physics and engineering, building an exact replica of the Great Pyramid today would be a colossal, expensive task with uncertain results. How is it possible that a civilization with only copper tools and wooden sleds managed to do it more than 4,500 years ago? This question is not just a popular expression of astonishment, nor a romantic exaggeration typical of mystery lovers. It is a real concern, openly expressed by numerous engineers, architects, and experts in modern logistics, professionals who, far removed from archaeological debates, have approached the topic of the pyramids from the cold reality of numbers, material capacities, and the physical limitations of any large-scale construction project. One of the most cited studies in this regard is the one conducted by NOVA in collaboration with National Geographic at the end of the 1990s, with the purpose of testing how feasible it would be to build a scaled-down replica of the Great Pyramid using techniques supposedly similar to those of the Pharaonic era. The team of engineers quickly encountered obstacles they never imagined. Despite having specialized labor, advice from archaeologists, and access to modern materials for logistical transport, the small team was unable to progress more than a few meters in height before facing problems of stability, tool wear, and logistics that were simply unmanageable. The conclusion was clear and direct. Replicating the process on a full scale would be a multi-million-dollar venture, technically risky, and with highly uncertain results. The NOVA case is not unique. Over the years, other attempts to reproduce ancient Egyptian construction techniques under controlled conditions have ended in failure, or solutions that have little or no resemblance to the supposed Bronze Age tools. The calculation of time, human resources, and materials required to complete a project as massive as the Great Pyramid in 20 or 25 years, as the official version claims, simply doesn't add up with modern technical reality. Engineers agree on several critical points. The first is the transport of the blocks. Moving and placing more than 2 million stone blocks, many of them weighing several tons, requires a level of coordination and infrastructure that today would involve the mobilization of hundreds of heavy vehicles, specialized cranes, and an army of trained workers. The second issue is precision. The pyramid's alignment with the cardinal points, with an almost negligible margin of error, and the millimetric adjustment of the blocks, which in many cases fit together with a perfection that astonishes even the most experienced stonemasons, presents a technical challenge that would require the use of advanced topographic instruments. The third key point is speed. If we assume that the pyramid was built in less than 3 decades, one stone block would have had to be placed every 2 minutes, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no interruptions for over 20 years. A figure that, according to modern logistics calculations, is virtually impossible. But the list of obstacles doesn't end there. There's also the issue of elevating the blocks as the structure rose in height. The ramp theories, so popular in official archaeology, are seen by many engineers as unrealistic. The amount of material needed to build a ramp capable of reaching the more than 140 meters of the Great Pyramid would exceed in volume that of the pyramid itself. Additionally, maintaining the proper slope, structural stability, and the strength of the ground to support the weight of the ramp would have been a monumental task in itself. Furthermore, no remains of such a ramp have ever been found, neither in Giza nor in any other construction from the era. Some logistics experts have proposed the possibility of using spiral ramps or counterweight systems, but even these alternatives present serious problems. The lack of archaeological evidence, the disproportionate consumption of resources, and the technical difficulties of maneuvering multi-ton blocks at great heights under those conditions remain factors that lead many engineers to admit, without hesitation, that replicating the Great Pyramid today would be an extraordinary challenge, even with the technological advances we have. And here comes another interesting aspect. Large construction companies and civil engineering firms, consulted on several occasions by media outlets and documentaries, have avoided publicly committing to the idea that replicating the Great Pyramid would be simple. Some have even openly stated that the economic cost and time required would far exceed the limits of any current commercial or governmental project. Engineer Jean-Pierre Houdin himself, one of the few specialists who has attempted to present a viable technical hypothesis regarding the pyramid's construction, acknowledged that even with all the modern machinery, the logistical and technical challenge would be of epic proportions. The question many engineers ask quietly is, why, if we are truly talking about a work executed with stone hammers, levers, and plant fiber ropes, has the modern community not been able to replicate it convincingly? This issue, though rarely raised publicly in academic circles, has led more than one expert to suggest, in private or in specialized forums, that perhaps we are dealing with a forgotten technology, a construction knowledge that was lost at some point in history, or that we simply do not fully understand the true purpose of the structure. In other cases, confusion turns into fascination. There are engineers who, without subscribing to any alternative theory, humbly acknowledge that the Great Pyramid is an achievement that exceeds the logical capabilities of the technology of its time, and that therefore it deserves to be studied not only as an archaeological monument, but as an extraordinary example of ancient engineering that still has much to teach us. The impact of this technical reality goes beyond the realm of construction. It also touches on deeper philosophical and scientific questions. How much do we underestimate ancient civilizations? How much lost knowledge was contained within those cultures we consider primitive? And how many modern prejudices prevent us from seeing clearly what is right before our eyes? The truth is that, to this day, the Great Pyramid remains, in the words of many of these contemporary engineers, a technical anomaly, a work that defies not only archaeology, but also the laws of logistics, physics, and modern engineering. A structure that seems determined to remind us, with every stone block and every perfect angle, that there is still much to discover, and that the true knowledge of the past remains as buried as the hidden chambers that, to this day, no one has been able to explore. Herodotus, liar or witness? When discussing the history of the pyramids and their construction, there is one name that inevitably comes up in almost every conversation, lecture, or academic debate on the subject: Herodotus. This Greek historian, considered by many to be the father of history, traveled to Egypt around 450 before Common Era, nearly 2,000 years after the supposed construction of the Great Pyramid. His work, the 9 books of history, contains testimonies of what he personally heard and saw during his travels in those lands. However, over the centuries, his account has been the subject of constant debate, swinging between reverence and academic contempt. The question that persists, generation after generation, is clear. Was Herodotus a naive transmitter of legends and exaggerations, or a witness to uncomfortable truths that later history has preferred to ignore? His description of the pyramids has been analyzed, criticized, and reinterpreted time and time again. Herodotus recounts that the Great Pyramid was built in a period of 20 years by over 100,000 men working in 3-month shifts. He speaks of ramps, enormous collective efforts, and a pharaoh, Khufu, who earned the enmity of his people for subjecting them to such hardships. He even mentions the involvement of the pharaoh's daughter, who, according to the oral tradition conveyed by his informants, had to prostitute herself to raise funds for the monument's construction, adding a dimension of moral decadence to the narrative. For a long time, Egyptologists considered Herodotus's account one of the primary historical sources on the construction of the pyramids. But starting in the 20th century, as excavations and archaeological investigations advanced, voices began to emerge pointing out errors, anachronisms, and exaggerations in his narrative. Today, in most academic circles, Herodotus's testimony is viewed with a mix of skepticism and condescension, as if it were the account of an unreliable traveler, more akin to legend than to documented history. However, this critical stance toward Herodotus also has its cracks. It is true that his work contains clear inaccuracies when discussing Egyptian topics, such as the duration of certain reigns or the description of funerary rituals. But what few mention is that Herodotus was consistent in recording what the Egyptians of his time told him. He wasn't inventing stories from his desk in Greece, but transmitting the oral traditions that the Egyptian priests and local inhabitants entrusted to him. This nuance is crucial because it implies that, while there may be errors in the details, the core of his account reflects the collective memory of a people who, 2,000 years later, still preserved a narrative about the pyramids filled with suffering, forced labor, and tales of oppression. Another aspect worth attention is that, despite the temporal distance, many of Herodotus's claims surprisingly align with the doubts we have today about the official version. For example, his reference to the use of ramps has been, for decades, the preferred explanation by traditional archaeology to justify how the stone blocks were lifted. However, to this day, this theory remains unsupported by solid archaeological evidence. No significant remnants of the supposed ramps have been found, and the volume calculations of the material needed to build them remain an unresolved problem. Curiously, Herodotus speaks of mud and wooden ramps that were dismantled after the pyramid was completed, which, if one thinks about it, could partly explain the lack of physical evidence. But even so, the archaeological gap remains too large for this explanation to be fully convincing. Herodotus also refers to a 20-year construction period, which coincides with the current official chronology for the Great Pyramid. But common sense, coupled with modern engineering studies, has cast doubt on that figure. If it would be practically impossible today to construct such a structure in 2 decades, how could a Bronze Age culture have done it? The coincidence of the chronological detail between Herodotus and the current version is, at the very least, striking. Another overlooked detail is that Herodotus never claims to have witnessed the construction of the pyramids. He simply narrates what the Egyptians of his time told him. This implies that even in Herodotus's time, the pyramids were considered by the locals as a distant legacy, almost mythical, from the past. The fact that 2,000 years after their supposed construction, the Egyptian population itself had no clear explanation nor accessible written documentation about how the pyramids were built is a fact that should have sparked much more academic debate than it has to date. On the other hand, it is important to note that Herodotus was not the only ancient traveler who was fascinated and bewildered by the pyramids. Other classical authors, such as Diodorus of Sicily and Strabo, also left their own versions, which, although differing in details, agree on the essentials. The pyramids were seen as works from a nearly mythological past, surrounded by mystery and, in many cases, contradictory stories. The question of whether Herodotus was a liar or a truthful witness is, in the end, one that has no simple answer. What is clear is that his testimony has been used and discarded according to convenience by official archaeology. He is cited when his statements fit the traditional narrative, and discredited when his words contradict or discomfort it. This selectivity in the use of his writings says much more about the attitude of modern academia than about Herodotus's reliability. Perhaps the greatest mistake we make when judging his words is analyzing them with the parameters and expectations of modern historiography. Herodotus was a chronicler who transmitted oral traditions, local legends, and stories passed down from generation to generation. He did not intend to be a scientist, but neither was he an irresponsible fabulist. His work represents one of the few bridges we have between the ancient world and the present. Systematically ignoring his account is to close the door to one of the few sources we have from a time when direct access to information about the pyramids had already been lost. The question remains open. Was Herodotus an indirect witness to uncomfortable truths that official history has preferred to bury under the weight of modern archaeology? Perhaps like so many other pieces of this millennial puzzle, the answer will only come when we are willing to stop looking at the past with prejudice and to listen, without filters, to what those who were closest to that enigma that still challenges our understanding truly told us. Acoustic levitation. Among the endless theories surrounding the mystery of the Egyptian pyramids, few captivate the imagination as much as the one suggesting that the builders may have used some form of sound-based technology to move and position the massive stone blocks that make up these structures. The idea that acoustic levitation played a role in the construction of the Great Pyramid might, at first glance, seem closer to science fiction than history. However, as one delves into modern research, experiments, and ancient accounts, the line between what is possible and impossible begins to blur in a troubling way. Acoustic levitation, in its modern definition, is a physical phenomenon that allows objects to be suspended in the air using high-frequency and high-intensity sound waves. While current technology only allows for the levitation of very small objects, such as water droplets or tiny polystyrene spheres, the basic principle has been proven. A sufficiently powerful sound source can counteract the effects of gravity. Particles are kept suspended in the air due to the pressure generated by standing waves, which create a point of equilibrium where the object remains suspended. Up to this point, everything falls within what contemporary science recognizes and can replicate in a laboratory. But the real question, the one that leads us directly into the realm of mystery, is whether this same principle could have been applied on a grand scale thousands of years ago, in a context where, officially, there was neither the technology nor the knowledge to do so. Some alternative researchers have pointed out that in various ancient cultures, including the Egyptian, there are symbolic and mythological references to the power of sound as a creative and transformative force. For instance, in the pyramid texts, there are passages that describe the use of sound formulas to reach the afterlife, while in other traditions, such as Tibetan, there are accounts of monks who could move stones using rhythmic chants and ceremonial trumpets. These stories, passed down through generations, have long been considered mere legends, but some researchers suggest that they might be distorted echoes of a lost knowledge. One of the most cited cases by supporters of this theory is that of a Swedish doctor named Jarl, who in the 1930s claimed to have witnessed in Tibet how a group of monks, using large drums and trumpets along with specific chants, managed to lift stones weighing several tons up the side of a mountain. According to his account, the stones were placed in a pit in front of a semicircle of musicians, and after several minutes of sustained sound, they began to rise into the air. Although this testimony lacks visual evidence and has been heavily questioned, it continues to circulate as an intriguing example of possible ancient applications of acoustics. In the specific case of the pyramids, some modern studies have explored the acoustic properties of the Great Pyramid, particularly the King's Chamber and the Grand Gallery. Researchers like Tom Danley, an acoustic engineering expert, conducted tests that showed certain resonant frequencies within the pyramid that are capable of amplifying unusually. These studies have shown that the internal chambers have a resonant capacity that could, in theory, have been used for purposes that we still do not fully comprehend today. The use of sound as a tool for manipulating matter, though it sounds extravagant, is based on current physics. It is known that certain frequencies can trigger resonance phenomena that affect the molecular structure of materials. In some laboratories, objects have been moved using combinations of ultrasound and acoustic cavitation. The question that remains open is whether a technology far more advanced than we can conceive was ever within the reach of prehistoric cultures, or if, on the contrary, we are projecting an unsupported technological fantasy onto the past. An argument in favor of this possibility is the absence of traces of transportation and mass movement on the Giza Plateau. If millions of blocks were truly dragged across the land with sledges and ropes, there should be evidence of access paths, storage areas, and clear evidence of the logistics involved. However, these signs are scarce or non-existent. The hypothesis that the blocks were moved in another way, perhaps through some form of energy manipulation, arises precisely as an attempt to explain this lack of direct physical evidence. The theory of acoustic levitation also finds resonance in the symbolism surrounding the pyramids. The relationship of these structures with vibration, energy, and sound appears in more than one esoteric text and in more than one alternative interpretation. Some researchers have even suggested that the pyramidal shape itself could be a natural amplifier of waves, which would have allowed acoustic energy to be concentrated far more efficiently than we can achieve today with our technological devices. Of course, critics of this theory have quickly pointed out that, at present, there is no archaeological evidence to support the existence of high-powered sound generators in ancient Egypt. No remains of large musical instruments or structures designed to produce standing waves at the necessary scale have been found. Furthermore, replicating an acoustic levitation system capable of moving blocks weighing several tons would require an immense energy source, the origin of which remains a complete mystery. But, as often happens with almost everything related to the pyramids, the fact that the theory lacks official acceptance does not mean it should be dismissed outright. The accumulation of anomalies, the absence of convincing explanations about the logistics of construction, and the growing evidence of unusual acoustic properties inside the Great Pyramid continue to fuel the suspicion that, perhaps, there was a technological component we still cannot fully understand. In conclusion, the hypothesis of acoustic levitation lies in that uncomfortable territory where modern science still cannot provide conclusive answers, but where the questions are too important to be ignored. The Great Pyramid stands tall, challenging our logic, calculations, and certainties. And as long as its stones remain in place, as if an invisible force had placed them there with impossible precision, the echo of these questions will continue to resonate, like a frequency traveling through time, waiting for someone someday to tune it in the right way. Where are the workers? One of the most unsettling and least discussed aspects of the pyramid enigma is the massive absence of human remains that can be directly and conclusively associated with the thousands of workers who, according to the official version, participated in the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The traditional narrative tells us that a labor force of tens of thousands of people, organized into teams, well-fed and relatively well-treated by the standards of their time, was involved. We are told that they lived in nearby camps, received rations of bread, onions, and beer, and that, when they died, they were buried with some respect in necropolises close to the worksite. However, when one examines the available archaeological evidence in detail, the picture becomes much more confusing than the official version suggests. Excavations conducted in the 1990s in the area known as Hayt el Ghurab, very close to the Giza Plateau, uncovered a set of human skeletal remains and structures that some researchers identified as the remains of the workers' settlement for the pyramids. This discovery was presented as definitive proof that the labor force of the Great Pyramid was not made up of slaves, but specialized workers operating under an efficient and well-organized state system. The media eagerly reproduced the news, reinforcing the narrative of the happy workers who built the monument as part of their devotion to the pharaoh. But when one calmly reviews the data extracted from these excavations, the numbers begin to tell a different story. The total number of human skeletons found to date in this specific area is small, far from what one would expect if a population of tens of thousands of active people had lived and died there for over 2 decades. The remains recovered mainly correspond to young individuals, many of them men between the ages of 20 and 30, which could fit the profile of workers, but the volume is insufficient. Even if we assume that not all workers died during the construction and that many returned to their villages after their work was finished, it would still be logical to expect a greater concentration of human remains in the immediate vicinity of the pyramid. Another element that fuels suspicion is the lack of tools and everyday utensils in a proportion consistent with such a large and active population. In the temporary settlements of other ancient constructions, such as Roman military cities or construction camps in Mesopotamia, it is common to find huge quantities of ceramics, food remains, damaged tools, and other daily waste that serve as a material trace of daily life. In Giza, evidence of this type is surprisingly scarce. The situation becomes even more puzzling when we consider that modern archaeology has forensic analysis tools that allow for a fairly accurate determination of the approximate number of people who inhabited a place and how long they stayed there. Studies of waste distribution, soil analysis, burial patterns, and bone density are standard methods in any modern archaeological excavation. However, in the case of Giza, the official reports on these aspects are vague, scarce, or outright non-existent. The information that reaches the general public is limited to headlines and general statements, without going into quantitative details. Some defenders of the official version have tried to argue that many of the workers might have been buried in other parts of Egypt, returning to their hometowns once the work was completed or after their death. While this possibility cannot be completely ruled out, it is also true that, given the conditions of the time, it would have been most logical for the majority of workers to have been buried near their workplace, especially those who died from work accidents, diseases, or physical exhaustion. The massive absence of tombs remains, therefore, a difficult gap to explain. From the realm of alternative research, this lack of evidence has been used to reinforce theories that question the chronology and method of pyramid construction. If we accept that there was not a colossal workforce, then the traditional account of the raising of the Great Pyramid begins to wobble. Some suggest that perhaps the construction was not completed in the short time frame proposed by official archaeology. Others go further and propose that maybe the pyramid was already there long before, erected by a previous civilization and simply reappropriated by the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty. This debate is inevitably connected with the inconsistencies we have seen in other aspects of the Giza mystery. The absence of proper tools, the lack of hieroglyphic records detailing the construction, and doubts about the true authorship of the monument. The absence of mass human remains adds to this chain of anomalies, which, when observed together, present a very different picture from what we have seen in textbooks or traditional documentaries. Official archaeology, aware of this gap, has intensified in recent years the narrative of well-fed and organized workers, proudly showing photographs of individual tombs of alleged foremen or team leaders. However, the existence of a dozen graves of supervisors does not solve the central mystery. Where are the thousands upon thousands of laborers who would have moved, cut, and placed the more than 2 million stone blocks? Today, the actual number of human remains recovered in the immediate surroundings of the pyramid remains uncomfortably low. Detailed reports are hard to find, and scientific publications that could provide clear data are scarce. The official response seems to be limited to repeating the same story over and over, without offering new verifiable elements that could satisfy the legitimate curiosity of those questioning this absence. Ultimately, the enigma of the missing workers is a key piece of the larger puzzle that the Great Pyramid represents. Because beyond technical theories, astronomical hypotheses, or experimental archaeology experiments, what remains as a physical and symbolic absence is the human presence that should have left a massive and obvious mark on the archaeological landscape of Giza. And the fact that this mark is so faint, so diffuse, and so insufficient forces us to keep wondering whether the true history of the pyramid is still buried, not beneath the desert sands, but under much deeper layers of denial, silence, and historical forgetfulness. Erosion that doesn't add up. If there is one element that could completely change our understanding of the antiquity of the pyramids and, by extension, the true history of human civilization, it is the issue of erosion on the Giza Plateau. At first glance, this may seem like a technical matter, something reserved for geologists and climatology experts. However, as one delves into the studies, analyses, and controversies that have arisen around this topic, what emerges is an enigma that threatens to undermine the very foundations of the official Egyptian chronology. The cornerstone, almost literally, of this controversy is the Great Sphinx of Giza. For decades, Egyptologists have assumed that this colossal sculpture was carved around 2500 before Christ, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafra. However, in the early 1990s, a geology professor from Boston University, Robert Schoch, proposed a theory that would shake the foundations of traditional archaeology. After analyzing the erosion patterns on the body of the Sphinx, Schoch concluded that the marks were not consistent with the action of wind and sand, as had been assumed up until then, but with a process of wear caused by prolonged exposure to torrential rains. The most shocking aspect of this claim is that for such a climate to have affected the Giza Plateau, we would have to go back to a period long before the official construction date of the Sphinx. According to Schoch's estimates, the last time the Egyptian desert experienced such heavy rainfall was at the end of the Pleistocene, that is, between 7,000 and 10,000 before Christ. This would place the carving of the Sphinx in a time when, according to the official chronology, Egypt did not even exist as an organized civilization. The archaeological community responded with a mixture of disbelief and rejection. Criticisms came from all directions. Schoch was accused of over-extrapolating from his geological observations and of ignoring the archaeological context. But the truth is that, to this day, no one has been able to offer a convincing geological explanation that completely discredits his analysis. Other geologists, such as Thomas L. Dobecki, supported his conclusions after conducting independent studies using ground-penetrating radar to analyze the underground layers around the Sphinx. The results were consistent. The pattern of water erosion is evident and profound. What makes this matter even more fascinating is that the Sphinx is not alone in this anomaly. Some sections of the pyramids themselves, especially in their lower areas and at the base of the structures, show signs of wear that could be compatible with similar processes of water erosion. Although the deterioration on the pyramids is less obvious than on the Sphinx, several researchers have pointed out that certain cracks and grooves in the limestone suggest the same direction. Prolonged exposure to intense rainfall, long before the rise of dynastic Egypt. Defenders of the traditional chronology attempted to counter-argue that the erosion could have been caused by other factors, such as desert dew, nighttime humidity, or even human action during centuries of neglect and mistreatment. But none of these factors explain the depth and characteristic shape of the marks, which almost perfectly match the effects of water erosion over millennia. Furthermore, geologists critical of the official version highlight another detail that is rarely mentioned. The most protected parts of the Sphinx, such as the area under its chest and areas sheltered by retaining walls, show much less wear than the exposed areas, which reinforces the hypothesis that rainwater played a determining role in the erosion. If wind and sand were the sole culprits, the wear pattern should be much more uniform. The most direct implication of all this is obvious. If the Sphinx is much older than we think, then the entire Giza complex, including the pyramids, could also be much older. The possibility that these monumental structures were built by a civilization that preceded the dynastic one, whose material traces have disappeared or are buried under layers of history and sand, suddenly gains unexpected solidity. This line of thinking also aligns with other enigmas we have encountered so far. The lack of appropriate tools, the absence of written records about the construction, and inconsistencies in the carbon dating of some associated materials. The puzzle begins to show an image that does not match the traditional narrative. But water erosion is not the only geological clue that raises doubts. Some researchers have analyzed the compaction of sediment layers around the Giza Plateau, concluding that the ground shows signs of having been subjected to much more extreme moisture conditions than those that characterize Egypt in the last 5,000 years. Even the wear marks in the quarry of the Sphinx, from which the material to carve the monument was supposedly extracted, show fractures and fissures that point to a much more complex and extensive geological history. The fact that the debate over the antiquity of the Sphinx and the pyramids remains a taboo subject in many academic circles only fuels the suspicion that the implications of accepting a date prior to the dynastic period would be too uncomfortable. Admitting this would mean rewriting much of the history of ancient Egypt and, by extension, questioning the chronologies of other civilizations that, according to the official version, arose much later. Despite institutional resistance, the number of studies supporting the hypothesis of greater antiquity continues to grow. New technologies, such as isotope analysis, geological layer scanning, and Holocene climate simulations, are providing data that reinforce the idea that the Giza Plateau witnessed climatic phenomena that do not correspond to the time of the pharaohs. In the end, the erosion that doesn't add up is one of those uncomfortable pieces of the puzzle, a crack in the official narrative that, no matter how much they try to cover it with quick explanations, remains there, visible to anyone brave enough to take a closer look. And as with every one of the enigmas surrounding the pyramids, the more time passes, the harder it becomes to ignore the fact that we are facing a monument whose true history may be much deeper in time than we ever dared to imagine. Atlantis and other forgotten civilizations. Every time one sits to contemplate the silhouette of the pyramids outlined against the desert horizon of Egypt, it becomes almost impossible to avoid letting the mind wander beyond mere archaeological contemplation. For these structures provoke a visceral need to question the origins of civilization, the limits of what we know, and, above all, how much we still do not understand. And in that mental journey we all embark upon when observing the stones of Giza, there is one name that sooner or later inevitably arises: Atlantis. For generations, the story of Atlantis has been relegated to the realm of myth, a legend told by Plato in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, as if it were only a philosophical metaphor, a warning about pride and the fall of civilizations. But beyond the symbolic interpretation, there is a growing group of researchers who have dared to consider the possibility that Atlantis might have been something real, a sophisticated culture that flourished in ancient times, and whose memory was engraved in the collective consciousness of various peoples, dissolved into legends, myths, and oral stories that have made their way down to the present day in diverse and fragmented forms. The connection between Atlantis and the pyramids of Egypt is not new, but in recent years it has gained renewed strength thanks to the research of authors like Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, and Robert Schoch. The basic theory suggests that if an advanced civilization did indeed exist before ancient Egypt, it is entirely possible that this culture left its mark on megalithic monuments scattered across the world, including, of course, the pyramids of Giza. Some argue that Egypt could have inherited architectural, astronomical, and mathematical knowledge from a much older people, whose direct traces were lost after a great catastrophe, possibly at the end of the last ice age. One of the key concepts within this theory is the so-called Zep-Tepi, which in Egyptian language means the first time. The texts of the pyramids, as well as other Egyptian mythological documents, refer to a distant period when the gods walked the earth and imparted their wisdom to the first kings of Egypt. Official archaeology has interpreted these references as pure mythology, but from an alternative perspective, Zep-Tepi could be an ancestral echo of a prior civilization, perhaps the same one that Plato described as Atlantis, or, in a broader vision, as a mother culture that preceded the known civilizations. If we widen our gaze on a global scale, the presence of pyramids and megalithic structures spread across different points of the planet begins to suggest patterns that are hard to ignore. In Central and South America, in Asia, in the Pacific Islands, and in Africa, the use of the pyramidal shape and cyclopean blocks appears repeatedly. This architectural coincidence has led some researchers to wonder, whether we are truly looking at independent developments, or if there was a cultural transmission whose origin remains shrouded in mystery. The astronomical alignments present in many of these monuments reinforce this suspicion. In Giza, the pyramids show a precision that challenges the technological capabilities attributed to the 4th dynasty of Egypt, but they are not the only ones. The pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico, for example, also feature significant cosmic orientations, as do certain structures in China and Southeast Asia. This repetitive pattern has been interpreted by some as evidence of global astronomical knowledge, perhaps transmitted by navigators or explorers from a civilization that existed before the collapse of the Earth's last great climatic event. Graham Hancock, in his famous work Fingerprints of the Gods, proposed that toward the end of the last glaciation, about 12,000 years ago, a global cataclysm, possibly the impact of a comet or a series of chained natural disasters, would have destroyed that mother civilization. The survivors, according to this hypothesis, would have passed on their knowledge to more primitive peoples, thus planting the seeds for the great cultures that would later blossom, such as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations. In this context, the pyramids of Egypt could be, more than the exclusive product of the pharaohs, a monumental legacy that those same pharaohs rediscovered and reused, integrating them into their own religious and political worldview. The lack of clear documentation regarding the construction of the pyramids and the absence of contemporary records of their erection fits surprisingly well with this hypothesis. If the pyramids were already there, their construction might have been omitted from records simply because they belonged to a distant past, whose true history had even been lost to the Egyptians themselves. Of course, traditional archaeology categorically rejects these theories. The lack of direct evidence for the existence of Atlantis or a prehistoric global civilization remains the main argument of those defending the orthodox chronology. Science, they insist, is based on material evidence, and so far, no unequivocal artifact has been found to confirm the existence of this mother culture. However, the proponents of these ideas counter that the evidence might be submerged under the sea, as is the case with the Yonaguni structures in Japan or the formations discovered on the seabed off Cuba. If the end of the last ice age caused a sharp rise in sea levels, it is logical to think that many coastal settlements were submerged, buried, and forgotten for millennia. The link between the pyramids and Atlantis is not a mere fantasy of mystery seekers. It is a hypothesis that, however uncomfortable it may seem, deserves to be analyzed with the same rigor as any other archaeological theory. Because if there is something that the pyramids of Giza teach us, it is that, for now, official history remains full of gaps, silences, and questions that are still waiting for answers. And perhaps, just perhaps, one of those answers will force us to look back to a much older and much more sophisticated past than we have ever dared to imagine. Molded stones? When one closely observes the stone blocks that make up the Great Pyramid of Giza, it is hard not to be mesmerized by the precision of the joints, the uniformity of the surfaces, and the apparent ease with which these massive pieces seem to have been stacked on top of one another. The traditional narrative tells us of thousands of workers cutting stone in quarries, transporting it with sledges and wooden rollers, and then polishing and adjusting each block until reaching the structural perfection that still defies the passage of time. However, there exists a theory that has been gaining followers for decades and could explain many of the technical mysteries surrounding the construction of the pyramids. The possibility that, instead of carving them, the ancient Egyptians molded the stones on site using a kind of primitive concrete or geopolymer. The main proponent of this theory is the French chemist Joseph Davidovits, who, since the late 20th century, has dedicated much of his career to proving that a large part of the blocks of the Great Pyramid are not natural cut stone, but a synthetic material made by the builders themselves. According to Davidovits, the Egyptians would have developed a technology capable of dissolving soft limestone by mixing it with water, salts, and other natural chemical reactants, creating a malleable paste that was then poured into wooden molds. Once hardened, the mixture acquired the hardness and appearance of limestone, but with a slightly different chemical composition from the nearby quarries. This hypothesis, which was initially met with skepticism and even mockery by traditional archaeology, has been accumulating evidence that makes it, at the very least, worthy of consideration. Various microscopic analyses of blocks from the Great Pyramid have shown internal microstructures and bubbles that are hard to find in natural limestones. Some studies have detected the presence of materials such as silicates and secondary minerals that, according to Davidovits and other researchers in his line of thought, can only be explained if the blocks were indeed molded. From a practical standpoint, the use of a geopolymer method would have allowed the pyramid builders to significantly reduce the logistical problems related to transporting and raising blocks weighing several tons. Instead of moving massive stones across miles of desert, they would have simply transported barrels of the liquid mixture to the construction site and poured it directly into molds, layer by layer, block by block. This approach would also explain why some joints between blocks are so tight that not even a razor blade can pass between them, and why certain blocks show millimeter-perfect adjustments to the irregularities of the lower block, as if they had been molded directly over them. Another strength of the geopolymer theory is that it resolves one of the great paradoxes of the pyramid, the apparent lack of traditional tool marks on many of the blocks. If they were indeed molded, it would make sense that they do not show the typical marks from chisels, saws, or hammers. Furthermore, the geopolymer manufacturing technology, though it might seem advanced to us today, could have been perfectly achievable for a civilization already skilled in the basic chemistry of lime, plaster, and other construction materials. However, official archaeology remains skeptical. Most Egyptologists insist that the blocks are made of natural limestone quarried nearby, arguing that the basic chemical composition matches the local geology. They also point out that, while bubbles and anomalous microstructures have been found in some blocks, these cases are rare and could be explained by natural alterations or weathering processes. Moreover, so far, no direct archaeological evidence of the supposed wooden molds or facilities needed to produce tons of geopolymer mixture has been found. Despite these criticisms, Davidovits' work has continued to evolve. Recently, new analysis techniques, such as infrared spectroscopy and X-ray diffraction studies, have shown chemical patterns that, according to some independent laboratories, present unusual characteristics for natural sedimentary limestone formations. These results have not been widely published in archaeology journals, but have been presented at materials engineering conferences and in specialized scientific forums on mineral chemistry. Another aspect that often goes unnoticed is that the use of artificial materials is not something so strange in the history of Egypt. There is documented evidence that the Egyptians were already producing complex chemical products such as pigments, ceramics, and plaster, several centuries before the construction of the pyramids. The idea that they applied this knowledge on a large scale in monumental architecture might have been a logical step in their technological development. Some independent researchers have gone even further, suggesting that the supposed knowledge of geopolymer production might have been a legacy inherited from a previous civilization, a technology passed on or rediscovered by the ancient Egyptians. This line of thought almost inevitably ties in with theories about lost civilizations and the idea of a past much more advanced than what history books admit. Of course, accepting that the stones of the Great Pyramid were molded would mean revising much of what we think we know about technology in ancient Egypt. It would completely change our perception of the construction process, labor organization, and the chemical capabilities of a culture that we have only attributed rudimentary stonemasonry techniques to. It would also raise new questions about what other knowledge the Egyptians might have mastered, or even if there was a forgotten technological period of which the pyramid is one of the few material remnants that remain. Whatever the truth may be, the geopolymer theory continues to gain interest as material analysis technology advances. The stone, an unchanging witness to thousands of years, holds within it clues that could change the official narrative forever. Perhaps, after centuries of searching for answers in quarries, we should start looking for them inside the very blocks themselves, where microscopic structures and chemical secrets lie in silence, waiting for someone to truly listen. The final question: who and why? After exploring each of the enigmas surrounding the pyramids of Egypt, after analyzing the technical anomalies, historical contradictions, archaeological gaps, and the theories that have attempted to explain the unexplainable, there inevitably comes the uncomfortable moment when the accumulation of unanswered questions forces us to stop and look at the big picture. This is no longer an isolated mystery or a small flaw in the official narrative. It is a chain of questions that, when viewed in their entirety, point to a disturbing conclusion. The history we've been told about the pyramids may be deeply incomplete or even radically wrong. The big question, the one that underlies each of the points we've discussed so far, is twofold. Who really built the pyramids? And perhaps more importantly, what for? Answering the first part of the question involves choosing from a range of theories that stretch from the most orthodox to the truly provocative. The official version tells us that the pyramids were built by the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, who employed rudimentary stoneworking techniques, human labor, and state organization to erect these colossal structures. But at this point, that explanation is beginning to falter under the weight of opposing evidence. Technical anomalies, the lack of direct records, the absence of proper tools, and inconsistencies in the chronology raise serious doubts about the pharaonic authorship. The hypothesis of a previous civilization, now popularized by researchers like Graham Hancock or Robert Schoch, opens a door to a much more distant past. A time before written history, even before the first Mesopotamian cities, where there may have existed a culture capable of handling astronomical, geodesic, and architectural knowledge that was lost after some great global cataclysm. Proponents of this view argue that the pyramids could be the last remnants of a mother civilization, whose memory only survived in myths like the Zep-Tepi or Atlantis. The water erosion on the Sphinx, the stellar alignments, and the lack of contemporary evidence of construction would, collectively, serve as indirect proof of this possibility. Another theory that continues to fuel the debate, despite its controversial nature, is that of the intervention of non-human intelligences. This is where the famous ancient astronaut theories come into play. Authors like Erich von Däniken and Giorgio Tsoukalos have suggested that the pyramids could have been built with the help of visitors from other worlds, either as landing stations, energy generators, or interstellar communication devices. Although most of the scientific community rejects these ideas for lack of direct evidence, the number of people who find logic in the extraterrestrial hypothesis continues to grow. The central argument is simple. The magnitude, precision, and unknown purpose of the pyramids could be the mark of a technology and knowledge that surpasses what a Bronze Age civilization could have achieved. There is also a lesser-known but equally provocative line of thought, the one that proposes that the pyramids were built by an earthly civilization, but not human in the modern sense. Some researchers speculate that before Homo sapiens, there may have been another intelligent species, now extinct or disappeared, that left behind an architectural legacy we still cannot fully interpret. And here we reach the second part of the question, perhaps the hardest one. What for? If we accept that the pyramids were not simply tombs, as we have already analyzed in previous points, then we must assume that their purpose was something else. The hypotheses are numerous and, in many cases, complementary. Some suggest that the pyramids were energy machines, designed to channel or amplify forms of energy still unknown to us. Others believe they functioned as gigantic astronomical observatories, marking key cosmic events for the survival or spiritual development of their builders. There are also those who propose that the pyramids were initiation centers, places where transformative rituals were carried out to alter the consciousness of those who participated in them. The acoustic and electromagnetic properties of the Great Pyramid, the ducts aligned toward specific constellations, and the strange resonances that can still be measured inside it, feed these theories. Even some physicists and architects who have studied the monument from a scientific perspective admit that there is something in its design that seems to follow principles we still do not fully understand. The energy hypothesis has gained particular traction in recent years. Recent studies have shown that, under certain conditions, the structure of the Great Pyramid can concentrate electromagnetic energy within its internal chambers. This finding, though still in the early stages of research, has opened up a new field of debate among physicists and engineers. The possibility that the pyramids were some kind of energy generator or accumulator, though improbable it may sound, is supported by empirical evidence that is still being analyzed. On the other hand, some researchers look to the sky, searching for hidden clues in the astronomical alignments. The coincidences between the arrangement of the pyramids and the stars of Orion's belt, the alignments toward the polar star of the time, and the symbolic references to Osiris and the afterlife seem to point to a direct relationship with the cosmos. According to this view, the pyramids would be a kind of stone star map, a reflection of the sky on Earth, designed to facilitate the spiritual journey of the pharaoh, or, perhaps, all of humanity to another plane of existence. And there is still room for one final possibility, one that combines all the previous elements but, in some way, transcends them. That the pyramids are a message, a kind of time capsule built not for their contemporaries, but for us. A monument intended to endure for millennia, facing sandstorms, earthquakes, and the erosion of time, so that, at this precise moment in history, when humanity is beginning to look back at the past with more critical and less complacent eyes, we can uncover that hidden message between the stones. In the end, the Great Pyramid of Giza still stands there, as motionless as it is enigmatic, like an eternal question carved in stone. A structure that, from its first stone to its last, seems to have been designed to generate doubt, to awaken curiosity, and to challenge our way of understanding the past. The great question will remain unanswered for now, but perhaps what is important is not to find a definitive solution, but to keep asking. Because as long as we keep questioning, as long as we keep the curiosity and spirit of investigation alive, the mystery of the pyramids will continue to fulfill its deepest purpose, forcing us to look beyond the obvious and accept that, when it comes to the history of humanity, there is still much to discover. If this journey through the mysteries of the pyramids has left you with more questions than answers, share this video, leave your opinion in the comments, and tell me, which of all these theories do you think is closest to the truth? Subscribe if you want to continue exploring with me what official history prefers to keep silent. Good night.